Hi, I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast, like a drop of rain remembering the sea. Today we're going to look with clear eyes at the road of control and the road of chaos, and we're going to choose chaos. Once there was an old king who had a son and 3 daughters. And one autumn he became very ill. And all the wise men of the kingdom looked at him, and they examined him, and they all concluded that soon he would die. So the old king called his son to his bedside, and then he began to speak. And he said, "My son, soon I will die, and you will become king. When you are king, I want you to rule this kingdom with strength and with compassion. And I also want you to look out for your 3 sisters. And I have a special request regarding them. When your eldest sister comes to you and says that she would like to get married, well, I don't want her husband to be chosen based on what she wants or on what you want. Instead, I want you to go to the balcony of the palace and to pluck a rose from the rose bush there and toss it out into the street. Whoever picks up that rose shall be her husband. And in fact, I would like all the husbands of your sisters to be chosen in this way. Will you do this, my son?" "Yes, father, I will," he said. And with that, the old king died. Well, the kingdom was in mourning for some time. But his son became king, and he ruled wisely and well. So time passed. Months became years. And there came a day when the eldest sister went to her brother the king, and she said, "Oh, my brother, I think it's time for me to seek a husband." "Wonderful," he said, "wonderful, but you should know our father had a last request on his deathbed about this. And it was this: he doesn't want you to choose a husband based on what you want, or on what I want. Instead, he wanted me to go to the balcony of the castle and to pluck a rose from the rose bush there and toss it down into the street. Whoever picks up that rose shall be your husband." Well, what do you think, dear listener? Do you think she said, "Oh, what a great plan"? Do you think she said, "Oh, what a lovely strategy"? No, she said, "That's crazy! Was our father nuts? Was he feverish on that deathbed? What was he thinking? What is this?" And her brother the king said, "I'm sorry, my dear, but that was his last wish." "Well, that may be, but I'm never getting married. If that's the situation, I am not getting married." And she stomped off. Well, that was her resolve. That was her mind made up. But, well, time went by. Months became years. And eventually she returned to her brother the king, and she said, "Well, my brother, that was our father's last wish. It's crazy, but if that's the situation, I'm willing to go through with it just to get married. All right, let's do this thing." So the 2 of them went to the balcony of the castle, and there was a beautiful rose bush there. It had been in the family for a long time. And her brother the king plucked a rose from that rose bush, and then he tossed it over the edge of the balcony and down into the street. Now, it was a busy day in that city, and many things were happening down there. There were people going this way and that way. There was a baker on the way to a job. There was a carpenter going somewhere. There was an old man beating a horse to get it to go faster. There was a pig. There were some kids. Oh, look, there's an old lady. Oh, there's the janitor from the monastery. All kinds of people were going by. And at this point, the oldest sister said, "I'm sorry, I can't watch," and she went back into the castle. Well, some time went by, and then, after a while, a prince on a white horse came down the street. And he stopped. He saw the rose. He stopped his horse. He got down from his horse, and he picked up that rose. And he smelled its smell deep into his bones. "Ah, what a lovely rose," he said. And at that point, the 2 guards at the door of the castle, they spoke up. And they said, "Excuse me, sir, the king wishes to speak with you." So they brought him inside into the throne room, and there the king said, "Young man, are you the one who picked up this rose?" "Yes, I am," he said. "Well, then you must marry my eldest sister." "What?" he said. "What? I'm just the son of a duke. She deserves the son of a king or somebody like that." "Well, be that as it may," said the king. "That's the way it is. It's just simply necessary for you to marry my eldest sister." Well, when she got a look at him, she figured, well, things could have been a lot worse. And the 2 of them had a wedding ceremony, there was a celebration, and then they went off to live in harmony and contentment. Well, time passed, as time does, and then the middle sister went to her brother the king, and she said, "My brother, I feel it's time for me to seek a husband." "Wonderful," said her brother, "but you should know our father had a last wish, which he imparted to me on his deathbed, and it was this. He did not want any of you to choose a husband based on what you want, or based on what I want. Instead, he wanted me to go to the balcony of the castle and to pluck a rose from the rose bush there and toss it down into the street. And whoever picks up that rose shall be your husband." "Oh, man," said the middle sister, "that's kind of nuts, but I guess if that was Dad's last wish, I will honor it. Okay, my brother, let us go. Let us do that." So they went to the balcony. Once again, it was a beautiful, busy morning in that city. And her brother the king, he plucked a rose from the rose bush there, a beautiful red, red rose. And then he tossed it over the edge of the balcony and down through the air down onto the cobbles of the street. And it was then that the middle sister said, "I can't watch," and she went inside into the castle. Again, it was a busy day. People were going this way and that. There was an old woman with tarot cards there under a tent. There were people carrying candles. There was a librarian going this way. There was a farmer. He had onions and potatoes in a wagon. There was a mule there. There was an astrologer. There was an astronomer with a telescope. Everybody going this way and that. And there was the rose on the cobbles of that street. Well, it was there for some time. But then finally a merchant came walking down that street. He was a perfume salesman on the way to his perfume shop. And he was walking down lost in thought when he looked down and he saw that beautiful red rose. And he bent down and he picked it up. And he smelled the smell of that rose deep into his bones. And then he said, "Ah, what a lovely rose." And it was then that the two guards at the castle door spoke up. And they said, "Excuse me, sir, the king wishes to speak with you." And so they brought him inside to the throne room. And the king said, "Young man, are you the one who picked up the rose from the street there?" "Yes, indeed, your majesty, I am," he said. "Well, then you must marry my middle sister." "What?" he said. "I'm just a merchant. She deserves the son of a king, or at least the son of a duke, somebody like that." "Well, be that as it may," said the king, "it is simply necessary for you to marry my middle sister." So the wedding was celebrated, and there was a big party, and the two of them went off to live in harmony and contentment. Well, some time went by, and during this time the king himself got married. So finally, the youngest sister, after all this had happened, said to herself, I'm going to get married too. And I've heard about this crazy arrangement our dad had, our crazy wish our dad had, but I will honor it. So she went to her brother, the king, and she said, "My brother, it's time for me to get married as well. And I've heard about this whole business of throwing the rose into the street, and, well, I'm up for it. So let me pluck the rose, and I'll toss it down there myself." "Very well," said the king. So the two of them went to the balcony. And there she was. She stood next to the rose bush. She plucked a rose from that bush, and she tossed it over the edge of the balcony, down through the air, into the street. Well, it was a busy day, as always. Chickens, mules, a janitor from here, an astronomer, a professor, a monk, a nun went this way, a baker, all kinds of people. There goes the butcher. There he is. Oh, there's a little dog. Oh, look at that. There's a farmer with a load of hay going down, creaking down the street. Well, people went by this way and that way, but nobody picked up that rose. In fact, it lay there in the cobbles of that street for a long time. Finally, the youngest sister and her brother the king went into the castle. Hours went by. What would happen to this rose? Would it get trampled by horses? Would a pig eat it? What would happen? Would it become garbage? People went this way and that. It was a big flurry of activity. Finally, hours later, down the street, came a young man who was all ragged and smelly. There was a cloud of flies around him because of his smell. And he was very ragged, and his clothes were all in pieces. He had rags and leaves tied to his legs to keep himself warm. And there was a big stick across his shoulders, and on either side of that stick there was balanced a water jug. And he was all bent over, creeping down the street. This was a man that everyone called Rags and Leaves, because of the rags and leaves tied around his legs to keep him warm. So he crept down the street, as he did every day. And finally he came to that rose there on the stones. And he saw it, and he smiled and put down his water jugs, and he took hold of that rose, and he lifted it up, and he smelled that smell deep into his bones. And he said, "Ah, what a lovely rose." And it was then that the two guards of the castle spoke up and said, "Excuse me, sir, the king wishes to speak with you." So they took him inside to the throne room, and the king was there. And he said, "Young man, are you the one who picked up the rose from the street?" "Yes, indeed I am, your majesty." Well, then it is necessary for you to marry my youngest sister." "What? Marry your youngest sister? I'm just a humble water carrier. I'm not anything. I'm not a merchant. I'm not the son of a king or a duke. I'm nobody. I'm not meant for her." "Well, be that as it may," said the king, "it is simply necessary for you to marry my youngest sister." Well, the wedding was celebrated, and the princess, well, she almost cried to see him, and he did not smell very good, and he was very ragged, but, well, she had to go through with it, so she did. There was a wedding, there was music, there was a celebration, and after that, the two of them got into a wooden wagon, and they loaded up their belongings, and the princess, well, she had a wooden box filled with her beautiful clothes, but they stayed in that box, and she got in that wagon, and off they went to the home of Rags and Leaves. But his home, well, it wasn't so much a home, it was a shack on the side of a mountain quite far away. And his mother lived there as well, and there were holes in the walls, and the wind came whistling through these holes all the time. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And so they began to live in that place. And every day the princess cooked and she cleaned. And she didn't wear her nice clothes. No, instead she wore a wool dress that her mother-in-law gave to her. And she weeded in the garden. She worked hard all day, and she was not very happy. It must be said she was not happy, because she longed to live in a palace with a handsome prince, and that shack was not a palace, and Rags and Leaves, well, he was not a handsome prince. And Rags and Leaves saw that she was sad, and this hurt his heart, for as time went on, he grew to love her very much. And then one night she had a beautiful dream. She dreamed that she did in fact live in a palace. And there were beautiful walls colored pink and green in that place. And there was a chandelier in that place covered in gold birds. And in the dream, she climbed to a tower at the top of that palace. And she could see far off, past the castle, past the city, to distant mountains far off, with snow on their peaks, glimmering and shining in the morning sun. But as she watched, a great wind came up and shuffled the leaves around in the courtyard below. And it whirled some dust this way and that, and the wind grew stronger and stronger, and she began to cough, and then she woke up, and she was in the shack with the wind whistling through the walls, and her mother-in-law was there, sweeping the dirt floor and coughing like an old mountain that was sick of being a mountain. Cough, cough, cough. And she realized she was in that shack. And Rags and Leaves was there, and she said, "My husband, I had the most wonderful dream." And she told him all about the castle she dreamed of. And he said, "Yes, indeed, my dear, that is a beautiful dream, but it is only a dream. We live in this shack on the side of this cold mountain, and we always will." So she tied the Rags and Leaves onto his legs, and off he went to the city to earn a living for all three of them there. But she was sadder than ever that day. And that night, when the sun went down, she cried herself to sleep in her bed there, as the wind whistled through the holes in the walls of that shack. But the next morning she awoke, and something felt funny. It was strange. Well, she had a blanket on, but usually it was a thin woolen blanket with moth holes in it. But today it felt thick and soft and very warm, very cozy. And she opened her eyes, and she saw a green wall. And she looked around, she saw another wall, and it was pink. And she looked above her bed, and there was a chandelier decorated with statues of golden birds. "What's this?" she thought to herself. "I am in a palace." She got out of bed. She pinched herself. It was no dream. She was really in a palace. There were servants there. They brought her breakfast. It was a beautiful day. There were windows there. She looked out at the dining room, and she saw gardens, statues, fountains, plum trees, and apple trees. It was a lovely place. So then she said, "Oh, I simply must tell my brother all about this. I live in a palace now, too." So she called for the royal chariot, and indeed a carriage came, a golden carriage, and it was pulled by 6 white horses. And so off she went very quickly through the streets over to the palace of her brother. And when she got there, he was glad to see her. And she said, "I live in a palace now too, my dear brother. You must come for dinner." "Why, of course," he said, "of course. Now where's your husband, that fellow Rags and Leaves?" "Well, it's funny," she said. "I haven't seen him in quite a while, but he must be around somewhere. I'm sure he'll join us for dinner." "All right," he said. "I'll see you then." So there was a grand banquet celebrated later that day. And the princess was there, and her brother, and her 2 sisters as well, and many of their friends, princes and princesses, all kinds of lovely people. And there was amazing food. There was veal smothered in mushrooms. There was 10 kinds of wine. There was amazing bread. It was a wonderful, wonderful meal there. But at a certain point, when they're all sitting at the long dining table lit by candles, Then a prince heard a noise, and he looked up at the ceiling, and he noticed there was a huge hole in the ceiling, and in that hole there was sitting a man. It was Rags and Leaves. His feet were dangling down, and he was watching everybody there, and he smiled and he waved. And this prince said, "Oh, there's Rags and Leaves." Boom! Just like that, the whole palace disintegrated into dust and ash. It fell all apart, and the princess woke up coughing. There was dust everywhere, and her mother-in-law was sweeping the floor again. There was dust in the air, and she was coughing, cough, cough, and the wind came whistling through the walls of the shack, and she realized she was not in a palace. She was in a shack on the side of a mountain, and that was her home. Well, she told Rags and Leaves about that dream, but he just pooh-poohed it. "Oh, that was another dream, my dear. You're dreaming all the time now, aren't you?" So he went off. She tied the rags and the leaves to his legs to keep him warm, and then off he went to the city to work as a water carrier. So time went by in that place, and life was not easy for the princess or for any of them in that place. And after a while, one night, she had another beautiful dream about being in a palace. And the next morning she told Rags and Leaves about it, and he said, "Well, my dear, that was a dream. Dreams are lovely, but life is not a dream. We live in a shack on the side of a mountain, and nothing will ever change that." So that day she was very sad. And that night, in fact, she cried herself to sleep. But the next morning she awoke, and things were once again strange. And her blanket, well, it felt not thin and moth-eaten, but it felt like a beautiful, fantastic quilt. And indeed, she opened her eyes, and it was a beautiful quilt. The quilt was embroidered with all kinds of stories from around the world. She saw pictures on that quilt. There was a bear with a fish in its mouth. There was a raven stealing the sun. There was a princess asleep in a tower. There was all kinds of things. And then she looked around. The walls were pink and green, just like before. And there was the chandelier, covered in statues of golden birds. Well, just as before, she had a lovely, amazing breakfast. And then she went off to visit her brother. She got there. He was there. He was glad to see her. "I live in a palace once more," she said. "Oh, lovely," he said. And they decided to have a dinner, a banquet in her palace that night. So once again they all assembled. Her brother was there. Her two sisters were there. All their friends and family came. There were bards there telling stories, long epics about the history of the world, and about how if you look in the eye of a snake, you can see all the 10 worlds before this one, and the 3 worlds after this one, and all kinds of amazing things. And everybody was enjoying the food and pouring the wine and just having a lovely time. But at a certain point, a princess heard a sound. And she looked up at the ceiling, and there indeed was a large hole in the ceiling. And there was a man, it was Rags and Leaves, sitting in that hole with his legs dangling down. And she looked up there and she said, "Oh, there's Rags and Leaves." Boom! Just like that, the whole castle fell apart again. Oh, there was dust everywhere, ashes, splinters, sawdust. Oh my gosh, and the princess woke up coughing, and there was her mother-in-law sweeping the dirt floor, and she was coughing as well. And the wind, the cold wind, came burning through the wall, in the holes in the wall there. "Oh boy," she said, "I live in a shack again. What is this? I keep dreaming of this palace." Well, time went on, and she worked hard. She had calluses on her hands from doing the chores. Her back hurt from leaning over and doing all kinds of things, drawing water out of the well and weeding in the garden and stuff like that. And she and her mother-in-law often argued, and she wasn't that happy, this princess, really. I mean, she loved Rags and Leaves, and he had grown to love her, but she still dreamed, she still felt she deserved to live in a palace, and that was no palace, that shack. And Rags and Leaves, well, he was no prince. Well, after a while, once again she had the beautiful dream. And once again she told Rags and Leaves about it, and once again he pooh-poohed it and said, "That's just a dream, my dear. You should stop dreaming and get used to this life here. This is where we live, and nothing will ever change that." That night, once again, she was very sad. Once again she cried herself to sleep. And once again, the next morning she awoke, and things felt strange, different. And that wool blanket was not there, and instead she had a beautiful quilt upon her, a quilt covered in stories. And there was the pink wall, there was the green wall, there, just as clear as day, above her was the chandelier covered in golden statues of birds. She got out of bed, and she said, "Aha, let's have a lovely breakfast." And wait, she said, "You know what? This time, no one in this place is going to say the name of my husband, Rags, and no one is going to say the name of my husband in this palace." That's what she decided. And then she had breakfast, a lovely breakfast. And then just as before, she got in her golden carriage, went off to visit her brother. And she said, "My brother, I live in a palace once again. We're going to have a beautiful banquet tonight. Please come to my place." "Why, of course," he said. "And what about your husband? Have you seen him? Your husband Rags." And nope, she said, "No, don't say his name. Please, please. That's a rule. That's the new rule. When you come to my palace, nobody says the name of my husband." "You mean Rags?" And nope, don't say his name. Nobody says his name in my palace. That's the way it is. He said, okay, I will see you for dinner." Well, they had a wonderful banquet once again. Everybody came. Her brother came, her two sisters came. And it was there was beautiful food, there was music, all kinds of things. Oh, just fantastic food there. And there was singing and all kinds of stuff. And then at a certain point, a prince looked up at the ceiling. And he saw there was a hole in that ceiling. And indeed, Rags and Leaves himself was in that hole with his feet dangling down. And he looked down at everybody and he was smiling. And the prince said, "Oh, there's Rags." "Don't say anything. Don't say anything." He did not say that name. They kept eating. After a while, the princess looked up, and there was that hole, and there was that fellow called Rags. Well, you know what his name is. So they kept eating. And after a while, Rags and Leaves himself climbed down and came down to the dining room table. And the princess stood up, and she found a chair for him, and she pulled it out, and she said, "My dear husband, please sit at this table. Be welcome here, and eat with us." "Thank you," he said. He was smelly, he was raggedy, there was a cloud of flies around him, but she welcomed him to that table. And then a little while later, his mother showed up. Yes, the princess's mother-in-law, she came in. She did not smell too good either, but the princess found a place for her at the table. She pulled a chair out and she said, "Here, my dear mother-in-law, be welcome in this place. Please enjoy this banquet with us." So they all ate in that room in that moment. A very shining and beautiful moment it was. And then when everyone was finished, the princess said, "Now, my friends, we must dance." So they all stood up, and she led the way to a ballroom in that palace. And Rags and Leaves said, "My dear, I must go put some beautiful clothes on. I will be right back." And he went away, and he came back dressed as the most handsome prince you can imagine. And then his mother as well, she said, "I must put on a beautiful gown. I will be right back." And she went off and came back dressed in the most resplendent gown. Oh, it had gold and it had red, scarlet colors on it. A beautiful gown. And then the music began to play, and everyone danced in the ballroom of that palace. And at a certain point, Rags and Leaves and the princess were whirling around in the center of that dance floor, like two flowers in water floating around each other in a beautiful, sweet moment there in the center of the music. And then Rags and Leaves spoke, and he said, "My dear princess, I was put under a spell years ago by an evil sorcerer, and now you have freed me from that spell. You have broken that spell by welcoming me to your table. Thank you for doing that." "You are welcome," she said. "I welcomed you to my table because I love you very much." And Rags and Leaves said, "This is our palace now. We live in a palace, and in this place we will stay." So they danced long into the night, and everyone did, and it was a beautiful, marvelous occasion. And I was lucky enough to be there. And I was given a bottle of wine at that party. And I was told that that wine came from grapes that were planted before the world was created. It was just an amazing wine. But I was going to share it with you, but unfortunately I lost it on the way here in the Ottumwa train station or the Detroit airport. Something happened, and so I don't have that wine for you at all. But I do have this story. And may this story nourish you. May it be a harbor for the boat of your soul. May it be a map to guide you through the labyrinth of this world. May it be a flower that you can carry with you wherever you go. A flower that reminds you of your true purpose in this life. And when the wolves of tedium attack you with Excel spreadsheets and boring forms to fill out, may you remember that flower. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Hey. Thanks once again for listening to this story. A rose tossed into the street. That's the image which grabbed me from this story. Sometimes that's the way it goes. There's a thing, an image that hooks you and then pulls you deeper into the story. A rose tossed into the street. Such a lovely image, and it seems so true. I feel like I've heard it a million times before, but it's really quite wonderful. And the rose is love, of course. The rose is the three sisters there, just tossed like that into the street. And it's just an interesting story. The king here does this thing where he seizes control from his deathbed. He seizes control of the future of his three daughters. So in one sense, that's kind of a patriarchal move, surely, because he doesn't want them to choose their husbands for themselves. But after that, it gets a little weird because he doesn't want the king, his son, to choose the husbands either. And in fact, he wants them to just throw themselves into the street, basically. It's a lottery. He's voting for the lottery, this king is. Why is he doing that? I'd love to hear the story. There's probably a whole nother story of why the king is like this, why he decided to do that. So that image, I wondered at it, and it rang true to me. It rang true to me. We're born into this life, and we're cared for, hopefully, as children. Some of us aren't, but hopefully we are. And our souls deserve palaces, perhaps. Is that what we want? Is that what we need? We deserve to be cared for and to grow up to live in beautiful places. But it doesn't always happen. And love, we want to be true. We want to find the partner of our heart, of our soul. We believe in that, especially here in the West. We believe in that quest. But at the same time, it can seem like something of a lottery. It can seem like luck and fate are involved in this as well. And it's not just with love, with finding a partner and getting married. It's in a lot of things in this life. For me, I can think of a million examples. Maybe you can too. For years, I wrote poems and sent them to magazines. That poem is like a rose. You spend days, months, possibly years getting it just right. And then you send it to magazines, and, well, it's the marketplace. What happens? Maybe the New Yorker accepts it, and maybe some small magazine in the far out reaches of Nebraska accepts it. Or perhaps nobody accepts it, and it gets trampled on, and that poem never gets anywhere. Your preparation matters. The caring and tending of that rose bush matters. It helps to have a good rose, but in the end, the world does what it wants in some ways. Buying a house. My wife and I bought a house 10 years ago. In some ways, that felt the same way. We both planned for that. I felt like I did all my homework. I worked hard. I saved the money. And then you get right down to it, and you're looking for a house, and what matters is what's available that month. So planning is important. Thinking ahead is important. Those things matter. But again, chance and luck are also important, and they have perhaps a greater role in what actually happens in our lives than we want to admit. So the king in this story, instead of defining and choosing as much as he can the future for his daughters, he throws it up to the lottery, and he votes for chance, basically. And again, it seems a strange thing for a king to do. We look for kings for providing structure in some way and for making those kingly decisions. This is the way it's going to be. But perhaps the key to understanding this character anyway is the fact that he's an old king. This isn't a young king. So presumably he spent his life making decisions and saying, well, we're going to put the garden over here. We're going to attack blah, blah, blah at dawn. Exports are going to be X and this and Y. He's making all these decisions about the country he rules. And maybe he's sick of it. That's what I wonder. He's about to die. And he's like, well, forget it. Screw it. I'm sick of making decisions. Let's let the world decide. Let's put our faith in the randomness and the miraculous, cruel, beautiful, strange, weird, beautiful lottery that is this life and is the world that blossoms every moment. So in that sense, it's something of a beautiful thing. And perhaps you too, or me as well, in our lives, we have voted for chance at times, and not just by gambling, but in other ways as well. Perhaps we too have been flingers of roses off of balconies. And I also find this story interesting from the point of view of class difference. In this story, the class differences working in that place, in the setting of the story, this comes from Sicily, I should say, from the Italian island down there. In this story, those class differences are very clear and they're very set. In some stories, it's not that way. But it's interesting that all the characters, except perhaps for the king, seem to believe in that. Even the prince, the first guy who comes along, the wealthiest suitor of them all, he says, she deserves the son of a king. I'm just the son of a duke. That's what he says. She deserves the son of a king. I'm just the son of a duke. And likewise, the merchant, the perfume salesman, and Rags and Leaves himself, they all say how they are not appropriate for the princess that they're going to marry. So they all have internalized that class structure, and they believe in it, and they don't want to violate it, which is interesting because other stories, fairy tales in particular, deal with a situation where somebody from the lower class climbs up through their own efforts, through luck, through magic, all these things. Elena the Wise, I'm just mentioning it because it's on my website there, but that's a story where a soldier ends up marrying up, basically. And often in those stories, the lucky person grabs hold of it, and the fairy or whatever says, you get to marry the princess, and they're like, great, that's awesome, let's go. But in this story, all the characters believe in that social order. And when the moment comes and the king is like, okay, you got to marry the princess, they say instead, they're like, oh no, not me, buddy. She's way above me. I can't marry her. That would mess up the social structure. So that's an interesting clue, and it seems to tell me or tell us that this story has something to say about social class and the how you can beat it and how you can't, perhaps, and whether it matters or not. And then this princess goes off to live with Rags and Leaves in the shack on the side of the mountain. And it's a different life than she wanted. And how are these lives going to be reconciled? Is she just going to be permanently unhappy in that place? Is she going to get used to it? Or is there going to be some kind of blending here of the worlds? And I love the dinner parties, these dinner parties where everything's so lovely, and then you look up and there's a hole in the ceiling. Have you been to a dinner party like that? Have you given a party or a gathering like that where everything's perfect, but sorry, I burned the rice, or the yogurt is bad, or whatever, we're out of beer, or whatever it is, So they're in the palace, everything's lovely, but there's a hole in the ceiling. By the way, there's a hole in the ceiling. And of course, as soon as that is noticed, everything crashes to the ground, literally crashes to the ground. So I love those images. And then, of course, how are things reconciled? How are things brought into harmony? She welcomes Rags and Leaves to the table with his smelly self and the flies buzzing around him. She welcomes him to that table. And not only that, but his mother as well. If you've ever been married, if you've ever been in relationship, you're going to find things which you don't like about your partner, right? That's just the way it is. Everything's lovely and awesome at first, and then you see the hole in the roof. So we get together with someone, and then after a while, you notice something you don't like. And so how do you deal with that? How do you reconcile yourself to that? Do you fight against it? That's usually anybody's first move, is to try to change the other person. You like the blue soap, but I like the green soap, so I'm going to tell you why you should like green soap. Or you don't like Chinese food, I love it, so I'm going to convince you to like Chinese food. But people don't change that easily, and maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we're the ones who should change. And in this story, I just love how it turns, because she accepts him. She notices him, and then everything crashes to the ground. And then she accepts him at the table there. And that seems to be the healthiest move, ultimately. there's something you don't like about your partner, in the end, you welcome that quality, that thing, to the table, and you feed that quality. You make it a part of your world in a beautiful way. You let them into the banquet so everybody can have a good time. And that seems to be good advice. So as far as marriage counseling goes, I think this story is a pretty solid one for you, for anybody. But I would also say that this story doesn't have to be about relationship, at least relationship with another human being. It can also be relationship with yourself. That's the Jungian move, which is to look at a story like this and see all the characters as parts of yourself. What part of you is like that king? What part of you is like the princess or any of the princesses? What part of you is like Rags and Leaves? And so to accept Rags and Leaves at the end, to welcome him to the table, is in that sense to accept the part of yourself that you don't want to accept. And that seems like a very healthy move. It is a very healthy move. And if we can do that, then we will find that we get to live in the palace all the time and not in the shack. So I guess that's what this story boils down to, is that the road of rejection and of refusing or fighting against what you can't accept, what you don't like, leads you to the shack on the side of the mountain where you are unhappy. And the road of acceptance, of welcoming what you have trouble with, what you dislike, leads to the banquet in the palace. Where life is pretty good, so it seems. So may we all be able to welcome those things we don't like, whether it's in ourselves or in others. And perhaps we will indeed find we are living in a palace which is lovely to us in the best way possible. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Thanks to the Patreon supporters, yay, who helped make this happen. And there's more info on my website, of course, jayleeming.com, JAYLEEMING, as well as other stories and ways to get in touch. If you have thoughts or opinions about this story, I would love to hear them. Thanks for listening, and take care.